I knew the HOA was bad, but I never thought they'd go this far. It started with a letter stuffed into my mailbox like a warning shot. A fine. $200 for unauthorized machinery visible from the street. That machinery was my old red tractor, the same one my dad used on this land before me. It wasn't broken down or rusting, it was in perfect working condition, parked neatly in my own driveway. But apparently that wasn't good enough for Wanda Thorne, the HOA president with an iron grip on the neighborhood. I crumpled the letter and tossed it into the back of the tractor. It wasn't the first fine she'd hit me with, but I'd always ignored them. My land, my rules. I figured she'd eventually get the message. I underestimated how far she'd go. The next morning, I woke up to the acrid stench of burning metal. Smoke curled into the sky from my driveway, and my stomach dropped. I ran outside barefoot, heart hammering against my ribs. My tractor was on fire. Flames licked up the sides, blackening the red paint as the tires melted into the pavement. Someone had doused it in gasoline and set it ablaze. I grabbed the garden hose, but it was useless. The fire had already gutted the engine, the heat warping the metal into something unrecognizable. My dad's tractor, his legacy, his hard work reduced to a smoldering heap of twisted steel. I turned slowly, scanning my quiet, HOA-controlled street. No one was outside, but I knew. I knew exactly who was behind this. Wanda. I stormed up to her pristine white house, my fist clenched. Before I could pound on the door, it swung open. She stood there in her pastel cardigan and pearl necklace, looking down at me like I was a stray dog tracking mud onto her expensive porch. "You should have followed the rules, Mitchell," she said, voice sickly sweet. "We don't tolerate unsightly machinery in this neighborhood." I took a step forward, barely restraining myself. "You set my tractor on fire." She tilted her head, feigning innocence. "I have no idea what you're talking about." I could see it in her eyes. She was enjoying this. "You're gonna pay for this," I growled. Wanda gave me a slow, satisfied smile. "I don't think so. And if you try anything, remember we still have the power to make your life very, very difficult." I wanted to rip that smug expression off her face, but I didn't. Instead, I turned and walked away, because I had something Wanda didn't know. My brother, Marcus, owned the local police station, and unlike the HOA, he actually enforced real laws. I didn't go back inside. Instead, I walked straight to my truck, climbed in, and drove to the police station. My hands were gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Every second that passed, the image of my dad's tractor burning replayed in my mind. Wanda thought she could get away with this. She thought this was just another petty power move, like slapping fines on people for leaving their garbage cans out too long. She had no idea what was coming. Marcus was in his office, sipping coffee and going over paperwork when I barged in. He barely had time to look up before I dropped the HOA's fine letter on his desk. His brow furrowed as he picked it up, scanning the text. "They fined you for a tractor?" he said, confused. I didn't sit down. "They burned it." His head snapped up, eyes narrowing. "What?" "I woke up this morning, and it was in flames. Someone torched it." I folded my arms, jaw clenched. "And I know exactly who did it." Marcus set his coffee down carefully. "You have proof." "She as much as admitted it." I let out a sharp breath. Wanda stood on her porch and told me I should have followed the rules. She was practically gloating. Marcus leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the desk. He wasn't just my brother. He was a cop through and through, and he didn't jump to conclusions without evidence. But he also knew me well enough to know I wouldn't come in here raging unless I was sure. "Arson's a serious charge," he said. "We need evidence before we can take this to court." I expected that. I nodded. "I've got security cameras on my property. If they caught anything, we'll have our proof." Marcus was already grabbing his keys. "Then let's go take a look." By the time we got back to my place, the fire trucks had already come and gone, leaving only the charred remains of the tractor. The air still smelled like melted rubber and scorched metal. My stomach twisted at the sight, but I forced myself to focus. I led Marcus to the security system in my garage and pulled up the footage from the night before. We fast-forwarded through hours of nothing until, finally, just past 2 in the morning, movement flickered on the screen. A hooded figure crept into my driveway, carrying a gas can. Marcus leaned in. "Pause it." I hit the spacebar. The person was turned slightly, their face mostly obscured but not entirely. Marcus exhaled sharply. "That's Harold. Harold Barker. Wanda's right-hand man on the HOA board. I should have known. We watched as Harold unscrewed the gas can and began dousing the tractor. A few seconds later, he flicked a lighter and tossed it. Flames erupted instantly, and he bolted back toward the street, disappearing into the shadows. I clenched my fists. That's all we need, right? Marcus nodded. That's more than enough. He stood, already pulling out his phone. I'll get a warrant. This isn't just HOA pettiness anymore, Mitch. This is criminal. As he stepped outside to make the call, I stared at the screen, my blood boiling. Wanda thought she was untouchable. She thought she could do whatever she wanted because she had a little bit of power over some suburban cul-de-sac. She was about to find out how wrong she was. Less than an hour later, Marcus and a couple of officers rolled up in a squad car. I stood on my porch, watching as they headed straight for Harold's house. The knock on his door was loud and firm. It only took a few seconds before Harold cracked it open, looking half asleep and confused. Marcus didn't waste time. Harold Barker, you're under arrest for arson. Harold's face drained of color. What? That's ridiculous. One of the officers turned him around, cuffing his wrists. We have security footage of you setting fire to Mr. Dawson's tractor. Harold stammered, his eyes darting to Wanda's house like he was looking for help. But Wanda wasn't coming to his rescue. She was standing in her front yard, frozen, watching everything unfold. As they shoved Harold into the back of the squad car, Marcus turned to her. We'll be investigating whether this was premeditated, Mrs. Thorne. If you had anything to do with it, I'd start getting a lawyer. Wanda's face twitched, but she didn't say a word. I stepped off my porch and walked right up to her. The police were still there. The whole neighborhood was watching. This isn't over, I said quietly. By the time I'm done, that HOA of yours is going to be nothing but a bad memory. For the first time, Wanda didn't look smug. She looked scared. She should be. The neighborhood had never been this quiet. After Harold was shoved into the back of the squad car, people stood on their porches, watching the scene unfold like they were afraid to blink. Wanda hadn't moved from her spot. She was gripping her cardigan so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. I didn't say anything else to her. I didn't need to. She knew this was only the beginning. Marcus spoke briefly with the other officers before they pulled away with Harold, leaving Wanda standing there like a statue. I walked back to my driveway, the blackened remains of my dad's tractor still smoldering. The fire department had done their job, but the damage was permanent. Marcus joined me, rolling his shoulders. Harold's looking at serious time for this. I didn't look away from the wreckage. And Wanda? His eyes flicked toward her house. We need proof she ordered him to do it. Arson's bad, but conspiracy to commit arson? That'll take her down for good. I knew he was right. Wanda was too smart to have gotten her hands dirty herself. She had Harold do her bidding, probably thinking she could deny everything if it ever came back on her. What she hadn't counted on was me having cameras. And Harold? He wasn't exactly the type to take the fall for someone else. I turned to Marcus. Harold won't stay quiet. Not when it means prison time. Marcus nodded. We'll see what he says once we get him in an interrogation room. In the meantime, you should prepare yourself. For what? Marcus exhaled. Wanda's not going to go down without a fight. He wasn't wrong. That afternoon, I got another letter from the HOA. This one was hand-delivered by a nervous-looking board member who practically shoved it into my hands before speed walking back to his house. I ripped it open, already knowing it wouldn't be good. A fine. $500 for property damage lowering neighborhood appeal. They were fining me for the damage they caused. I clenched the paper, my pulse pounding. This wasn't just a desperate attempt to save face. This was a warning. Wanda was telling me she wasn't done. She was doubling down. I marched straight to her house. She must have been expecting me because she was already standing on her porch, arms crossed. I see you got my letter, she said, tilting her chin up. You're real bold for someone whose henchman just got arrested, I said. She shrugged. The HOA has standards to maintain. If you won't keep your property presentable, we will. I stepped closer. You think this is going to stop me? She smiled cold, calculated. You don't have proof I had anything to do with Harold's actions. And the HOA has every right to fine you for neighborhood violations. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. You're really desperate, aren't you? Her expression didn't change. I'm simply maintaining order. I stared at her for a long moment. She wasn't scared anymore. No, she was betting on me backing down. She thought I'd get tired, that I'd let this go. That wasn't happening. You just made the biggest mistake of your life, I said. She didn't respond, but I could see the flicker of doubt in her eyes. I turned away, my mind already working. If she wanted a fight, She was getting one. I spent the rest of the afternoon making calls. First to Marcus, letting him know what happened. Then to my lawyer. Because if Wanda wanted to play dirty, I was going to bury her in legal paperwork. By the next morning, a cease and desist letter was drafted and sent to the HOA. They had no grounds to fine me for property damage caused by their own board members' criminal actions. It was retaliation, plain and simple, and my lawyer made it clear that if they pursued it, we'd be taking them to court. I knew Wanda wouldn't back off that easily, but I wasn't stopping there. I spent the next few days talking to my neighbors. Turns out, I wasn't the only one sick of the HOA's nonsense. The more I talked, the more stories I heard: unfair fines, forced landscaping changes, threats of foreclosure over technicalities. Wanda had ruled this neighborhood like a tyrant for years, and people were afraid of her. But after Harold's arrest, that fear was cracking. I organized a meeting at my place. At first, people were hesitant, but when they saw how many others showed up, they started to open up. One man, Greg, spoke first. She fined me $1,000 for painting my shutters the wrong shade of blue. Another woman, Linda, shook her head. She tried to evict my grandmother for having a wheelchair ramp that wasn't aesthetically pleasing. The stories kept coming, one after another. I stood up, looking around the room. We don't have to put up with this anymore. A murmur ran through the crowd. She's too powerful, someone muttered. I shook my head. Not if we stand together. I laid out the plan. We were going to gather signatures of petition to remove Wanda and the entire HOA board. If we got enough, we could force a vote. By the time the meeting ended, we had a game plan. Wanda had spent years keeping everyone divided, making them think they were alone. But that was over. She wanted a war? She just lost the neighborhood. The petition took off faster than I expected. The anger in the neighborhood had been simmering under the surface for years, and now that people saw a way out, they grabbed onto it with both hands. Every day, more names were added. Homeowners who'd been too afraid to speak up before were suddenly knocking on my door, sharing their own horror stories about the HOA's overreach. Greg, who had been fined for his shutters, took charge of organizing the signatures. Linda, the woman whose grandmother had nearly lost her home over a wheelchair ramp, reached out to others who had been impacted by Wanda's ruthless enforcement. By the end of the first week, we had over half the signatures we needed. Wanda must have caught wind of it, because that's when the harassment started. First, it was the letters, threats disguised as official HOA notices. They claimed that participating in a hostile campaign against the board was a violation of the bylaws, punishable by fines and even potential legal action. I tore mine up without a second thought, but not everyone in the neighborhood was as confident. Greg showed up at my house one evening, clutching his notice with a look of uncertainty. He waved the paper in front of me. "This is scaring people," he said. "Some of the ones who already signed are talking about backing out." I took the letter from him and scanned it. It was pure intimidation, nothing more. It had no legal backing, no reference to any actual laws, just vague wording meant to sound official. I shook my head. She's bluffing. There's nothing in the bylaws that says we can't challenge the board. She just wants people afraid. Greg sighed. It's working. I knew we had to move fast. That night, I met with Marcus again. He was already knee-deep in the investigation against Harold, but when I told him about the HOA's latest stunt, he wasn't surprised. "She's panicking," he said. "She knows she's losing control." I leaned back in my chair. "We need to hit her with something big. Something that makes people realize she has no real power." Marcus thought for a moment before nodding. "Let's take a closer look at the HOA's finances." That was the key. Wanda had been running the HOA like her personal empire, but empires had foundations, and if we could crack hers, the whole thing would come tumbling down. Over the next few days, I worked with Marcus and a couple of neighbors who had backgrounds in accounting. We combed through every financial report the HOA had ever released: dues, fines, expenses. That's when we found it. Buried in the records were discrepancies, thousands of dollars collected in fines that had never been accounted for. HOA dues that had supposedly gone toward community beautification, but had no receipts or invoices attached. Money that simply disappeared. Greg, who had some experience in finance, whistled low as he flipped through the numbers. "This looks like embezzlement." That was all I needed to hear. The next HOA meeting was in 2 days. We had planned to present the petition then, but now we had something even better. The night of the meeting, the community center was packed. More people had shown up than I'd ever seen at one of these things. Wanda sat at the front of the room, flanked by what remained of her board. Harold's seat was empty, a reminder to everyone of what had already unraveled. She cleared her throat and started the meeting as if nothing was happening, droning on about neighborhood compliance and maintaining community standards. I waited until she finished her speech before standing up. "I have something to present to the board," I said, my voice carrying over the murmurs in the room. Wanda glanced at me coolly. "This isn't the time for." I cut her off by holding up a thick folder. "This is a financial audit of the HOA's records." Silence fell over the room. Wanda's face didn't change, but I saw the slight tension in her shoulders. I handed copies to a few people in the front row. "According to these records, thousands of dollars in fines and dues have gone unaccounted for. That money was supposed to go toward community improvements, but there's no record of where it actually went." A murmur spread through the crowd as people flipped through the pages. Linda spoke up, her voice sharp. "So where's the money, Wanda?" Wanda's smile was tight. "This is a gross misrepresentation of our finances. The HOA's funds are handled appropriately, and any discrepancies are simply a matter of bookkeeping." Marcus, who had been sitting quietly in the back, stood up and held up his badge. "Actually, I've already sent these records to a forensic accountant. If there's any mismanagement or worse, embezzlement, it'll come to light." Wanda's composure cracked. For the first time, the fear was real. She opened her mouth, but before she could say anything, an older man near the back stood up. "I think it's time we vote on the petition to remove the board." The room erupted in agreement. Wanda's eyes darted around, searching for support, but there was none left. The vote was swift. By the end of the night, Wanda and what remained of her board had been removed. The HOA wasn't dissolved, at least, not yet, but it was under new leadership, and the first order of business was a full financial audit. As Wanda left the room, defeated, she paused near me. Her voice was low, bitter. "You think you've won?" I met her gaze without hesitation. "I know I have." She stormed out, and just like that, her reign was over. The next morning, Marcus called me. "Turns out, the forensic accountant found more than just mismanagement," he said. "One is looking at criminal charges." I leaned against my truck, taking in the sunrise over my land. Justice had finally come to the neighborhood. The fallout from Wanda's removal hit the neighborhood like a thunderclap. In the days following the vote, people who had once tiptoed around the HOA's rules were suddenly breathing freely again. The oppressive fines, the constant surveillance, the ridiculous restrictions, it was all crumbling. But the real storm came when the forensic accountant finished their work. Marcus called me late in the evening, his voice carrying a weight I hadn't heard before. "They found fraudulent withdrawals going back over 5 years, he said. Wanda wasn't just mismanaging HOA funds, she was siphoning them directly into a personal account. I exhaled sharply. How much? Over $80,000. That number hit like a punch to the gut. Wanda had been bleeding the neighborhood dry while pretending it was all for community standards. "We have enough to charge her with multiple counts of embezzlement and fraud," Marcus continued. "She's not just losing her position, she's going away for a long time." The moment I hung up, I knew what needed to happen next. The HO had scheduled an emergency town hall to address the financial scandal, and I made sure to be there, front and center. The new interim president, a man named Carl who had previously been too afraid to speak out, stood at the podium, reading from a stack of official documents. After reviewing the financial records, it has been determined that former HOA President Wanda Thorne engaged in fraudulent activity, misappropriating funds intended for community improvements. A murmur ran through the packed room. The same people who had once feared Wanda's authority were now looking at each other with a mix of disbelief and anger. Carl cleared his throat. "As of today, a formal criminal complaint has been filed. The authorities will be handling the rest." The doors swung open at that exact moment. Wanda entered, her usual pristine appearance slightly frayed at the edges, her confidence not as ironclad as before. She must have heard about the meeting and come to do damage control, but she hadn't expected the entire neighborhood to turn against her. She strode forward, her voice sharp. "This is a complete mischaracterization of the situation. Any financial discrepancies are purely clerical errors." Marcus, who had been standing near the back, stepped forward. "It's not a clerical error when the money is sitting in your personal bank account," he said. "We traced every transfer, Wanda. There's no getting out of this." Wanda turned to him, her eyes flashing. "You have no authority here." Marcus didn't bother responding. Instead, he pulled out a warrant. "This is from the county prosecutor's office," he said. Wanda Thorne, you're under arrest for embezzlement and fraud. The room erupted in whispers as two uniformed officers stepped forward. Wanda's face twisted in disbelief. This is ridiculous. You can't do this. One of the officers took her by the arm, but she yanked away, her voice rising. I devoted years to this community. Everything I did was for the betterment of this neighborhood. A woman in the crowd, an elderly resident named Mrs. Patterson, shook her head. You stole from us, Wanda. This wasn't about the neighborhood. It was about you. Others nodded in agreement, their expressions hard. For the first time, Wanda looked vulnerable. She scanned the crowd, searching for support, but there was none. The officers cuffed her wrists. This is a mistake, she hissed. I'll fight this. I'll be back. Marcus leveled her with a steady look. No, Wanda. You won't. As she was led out, the weight of her downfall settled over the room. Carl stepped back to the podium, clearing his throat. With Wanda gone, we need to decide the future of this HOA. The discussion that followed was unlike any HOA meeting I'd ever attended. There were no threats, no fines, no condescending speeches about the right way to maintain a lawn. People spoke openly, airing grievances that had been bottled up for years. By the end of the night, it was unanimous. The HOA was being dissolved. The relief in the room was palpable. People shook hands, exchanged smiles, and for the first time in years, it felt like a real community instead of a dictatorship. As the meeting wrapped up, Greg approached me, shaking his head in disbelief. I never thought we'd actually get rid of her, he admitted. I clapped him on the shoulder. Neither did she. The days that followed were filled with change. Without the HOA looming over everyone, the neighborhood transformed. People repainted their homes without fear of fines. Kids played in front yards without being scolded for excessive noise. The tension that had once gripped the streets evaporated. One afternoon, as I sat on my porch, watching the sun sink low over the horizon, Marcus pulled into my driveway. He stepped out, hands in his pockets. Thought you'd want an update, he said. I raised an eyebrow. On Wanda? He nodded. She took a plea deal. She'll be serving time, but not as much as she would have if she fought it. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Marcus looked at the empty space where my dad's tractor used to be. You gonna replace it? I exhaled. Yeah, it won't be the same, but I'll find one. He nodded, then smirked. Maybe park it right where the old one was, just to remind everyone what started all this. I laughed. You know what? I just might. As he drove away, I leaned back in my chair, taking in the quiet, peaceful evening. The fight was over. The neighborhood was ours again. And Wanda? She was nothing more than a bad memory. The neighborhood settled into a new rhythm, one that didn't involve HOA board members lurking around with clipboards or threatening fines over flower beds. The weight that had pressed down on everyone for years was gone, and in its place was something better: actual community. People who had barely spoken before started helping each other out. Greg, now free to repaint his shutters whatever color he wanted, offered to help others fix up their homes. Linda organized a block party, the first one in over a decade, since Wanda had banned unauthorized gatherings. It was like the entire street had woken up after years of being smothered under ridiculous regulations. And yet, despite all the good, there was still one thing left unfinished. The tractor. The scorched remains had been towed away, but the empty space it left behind gnawed at me. It wasn't just about the machine, it was about what it represented. My dad's hard work. The land we'd built our lives on. The sheer principle of the matter. One evening, while sitting on the porch, I made up my mind. I drove out to a farm auction a few towns over, determined to find something worthy of replacing what was lost. Rows of machinery stretched across the lot, everything from rusted-out relics to brand-new models with price tags that made my stomach turn. Then I saw it. A red tractor, not identical to my dad's, but close enough that something in my chest tightened. It had been well cared for, the paint still vibrant, the engine clean. I ran my fingers along the side, feeling the cool metal under my palm. This was the one. The bidding was competitive, but I wasn't leaving without it. When the auctioneer finally slammed his gavel and called out my winning number, a sense of victory settled over me. By the time I got it home, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the street. As I parked it in my driveway, right where the old one had been, a few neighbors wandered over. Greg let out a low whistle, nodding in approval. Linda crossed her arms, grinning. A couple others clapped me on the back, congratulating me like I'd just won a battle which, in a way, I had. Marcus showed up not long after, leaning against his truck as he took in the sight. He didn't say anything at first, just studied the machine like he was weighing what it meant. Then he nodded, once. "Looks good," he said. I patted the side of the tractor. "Looks right." He exhaled, glancing around the street. "Feels different around here now." It did. The tension was gone. No one was watching from behind curtains, waiting to pounce on some minor infraction. No one was afraid of stepping out of line. Marcus pushed off his truck. "You did this, you know." I shook my head. "We all did." He considered that for a moment, then handed me a cold beer from the cooler in his truck bed. We sat on the porch, watching as the street lights flickered on, casting a warm glow over a neighborhood that finally belonged to the people living in it. It wasn't just a win against Wanda. It was a win for every person who had been pushed around by an HOA board that thought it was above the law. As the night stretched on, neighbors lingered, laughing, talking, enjoying the kind of freedom they hadn't had in years. And for the first time in a long time, everything felt exactly as it should be.